There's a quiet moment that happens long before a man ever discovers betrayal. It's not dramatic, it doesn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It's subtle, almost invisible. And if you've ever felt that something changed in a woman you trusted but you couldn't explain exactly what, it's usually because this moment already passed. Stay with me because near the end of this video, I'll explain the one shift most men misunderstand and why reacting the wrong way often costs them their self-respect. And if conversations like this help you understand relationships more clearly, take a second to like the video and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but because this kind of awareness changes lives. When a woman cheats, the biggest change doesn't happen in her behavior first. It happens internally in how she reorganizes her emotional world. Contrary to popular belief, cheating is rarely about impulse alone. It's about permission, and that permission is psychological, not physical. Before the act ever occurs, something fractures inside her self-image. Most women see themselves as loyal, caring, emotionally principled. When that self-image comes into conflict with her desires, her mind doesn't collapse. It adapts. This is where the first change happens. She begins rewriting the story she tells herself about the relationship. You might notice her becoming more emotionally distant, but not cold. There's often a strange calm to her. That's not peace, it's compartmentalization. She separates who she is with you from who she is becoming elsewhere. Psychologically, this allows her to reduce guilt without confronting the deeper discomfort of self-betrayal. Another early change is subtle emotional reallocation. Her empathy shifts, not disappears, but redirects. She may still care about your well-being, but your emotional reactions begin to feel inconvenient to her. When a woman cheats, her nervous system starts prioritizing emotional safety over emotional honesty. That means avoiding conversations that could trigger guilt, shame, or accountability. You may also sense a new kind of certainty in her opinions. This isn't confidence, it's justification. To maintain inner balance, her mind begins framing you as emotionally unavailable, controlling, distracted, or inadequate. Not necessarily because it's true, but because the psyche needs a reason. Cheating without justification creates cognitive dissonance, and the mind will always choose a story over discomfort. What many men miss here is this. The change is not driven by excitement, it's driven by relief. Relief from internal conflict. Relief from unmet emotional needs she may or may not have communicated clearly. Relief from confronting her own dissatisfaction directly. And here's the most important part. Listen carefully. These changes don't mean she no longer values you as a person. They mean she is protecting her internal narrative. That distinction matters because men who personalize this too quickly often respond with anger, control, or desperation. And those reactions, while human, usually accelerate emotional separation rather than repair. This video isn't about blaming women, it's about understanding the psychological mechanics behind betrayal. So you stop guessing, stop overreacting, and start responding from clarity instead of pain. After the internal shift takes place, the next change shows up in how a woman relates to truth itself. Not objective truth, but emotional truth. This is where many men feel confused because conversations start sounding familiar yet somehow hollow she speaks. But something feels missing. That's because her relationship with honesty has quietly transformed. Psychologically, when a woman cheats, her mind doesn't suddenly become deceptive by nature. Instead, it becomes selective. She begins filtering information not to hurt you, but to protect her internal balance. This is an important distinction. Most men assume lies are about manipulation. In reality, they're often about emotional self-preservation. You may notice that she shares less detail about her day, not because she has something dramatic to hide, but because details create vulnerability. Specifics invite follow-up questions, and questions threaten the fragile structure she's built to avoid confronting herself. Another change appears in emotional tone. She may sound more neutral, less reactive, less invested in resolving tension. This isn't indifference, it's emotional flattening. When someone carries guilt beneath the surface, the nervous system often dampens emotional highs and lows to avoid exposure. Passion decreases, conflict becomes exhausting. Even laughter may feel restrained. This is also when moral language subtly shifts. She might talk more about needing space, finding herself, or not feeling like herself anymore. These phrases aren't meaningless. They signal an internal identity conflict. Her old self, the loyal partner, no longer fully aligns with her current behavior. Rather than face that fracture directly, the psyche reframes it as personal growth or emotional confusion. One of the most misunderstood changes happens in how she responds to your vulnerability. If you express hurt, suspicion, or emotional need, she may respond with impatience or defensiveness. Not because your feelings are invalid, but because they activate guilt, and guilt, when unresolved, often transforms into irritation. Men often misread this as cruelty. In truth, it's avoidance. Your emotional presence becomes a mirror she doesn't want to look into. There is also a shift in how she experiences attraction toward you. Attraction doesn't disappear instantly, but it becomes conditional. It depends on whether being close to you threatens her internal narrative. When closeness feels emotionally dangerous, distance feels safer, even if it costs intimacy. Here's where many men make a critical mistake. They try harder, they become more accommodating, more attentive, more emotionally available, hoping to restore connection. While well-intentioned, this often backfires. Increased emotional pursuit can heighten her discomfort because it intensifies the contrast between who she appears to be and what she's hiding. The deeper psychological reality is this: after cheating, a woman's primary relationship is no longer with you or the other person. It's with her own conscience. Every interaction passes through that filter. And if you're wondering whether this means the relationship is doomed, pause. Understanding this phase isn't about predicting outcomes. It's about recognizing dynamics so you don't lose yourself trying to manage emotions that aren't yours to carry. Awareness doesn't weaken a man, it stabilizes him. And stability, emotional, psychological, internal, is the one thing that quietly changes the power dynamic in any relationship, regardless of what comes next. As this internal conflict continues, another profound change takes place, one that many men feel but struggle to articulate. Her sense of emotional authority shifts. She begins trusting her feelings more than shared reality. This isn't arrogance, it's a coping mechanism. When a woman cheats, her emotions become evidence in her mind. If she feels misunderstood, then misunderstanding must exist. If she feels disconnected, then the relationship must be lacking. Feelings stop being signals and start becoming conclusions. And once emotions become conclusions, conversation becomes difficult. You may notice that disagreements no longer feel collaborative. They feel final. There's less curiosity, less willingness to explore nuance. She isn't trying to win arguments. She's trying to protect certainty. Uncertainty would require self-examination, and self-examination threatens the psychological balance she's worked hard to maintain. Another subtle change is emotional rehearsal. She begins preparing, often unconsciously, for a future version of herself. This might show up as increased independence, new routines, or a stronger emphasis on personal boundaries that didn't exist before. On the surface, it looks healthy, and sometimes parts of it are, but psychologically, it also serves as emotional insurance. This is where many men feel replaced, not by another person, but by a version of her that no longer emotionally includes them in the same way. She may still be present physically, still engaged socially, but emotionally, she's rehearsing life with less reliance on you. Her language also changes. She speaks more in absolutes. I've always felt this way. I just know what I need now. These statements aren't meant to dismiss you. They're meant to silence doubt, both yours and hers. Certainty becomes a shield. One of the most painful changes for men is the shift in accountability. She may become less receptive to feedback and more sensitive to perceived criticism. This doesn't mean she's incapable of responsibility. It means accountability feels dangerous. Owning her actions fully would force her to confront the emotional consequences she's been avoiding. And here's the part most men don't expect. Beneath this emotional rigidity is often fear. Not fear of being caught, but fear of being seen clearly. Fear that if all layers are exposed, she will lose not just the relationship, but her sense of being a good person. Men often respond to this phase by arguing facts, timelines, and logic. They try to prove inconsistencies, but emotional certainty cannot be dismantled with logic alone. In fact, doing so often strengthens defensiveness. The healthier response begins internally. It's about anchoring yourself in reality without forcing her into it. Calm observation, emotional boundaries, self-respect without punishment. Because here's the truth that matters: when a woman shifts into emotional self-protection mode, the man who remains grounded, neither reactive nor pleading, becomes the only stable reference point in the dynamic. This isn't about control, it's about presence. And presence, when paired with clarity, changes how both people experience the situation. Understanding this phase helps you stop chasing explanations and start preserving your own emotional center. And that shift, quiet, internal, dignified, is something she will feel, whether she acknowledges it or not. As time passes, another change begins to surface, one that affects how a woman relates not just to you, but to intimacy itself. And here, I want to be precise. This is not about physical closeness, it's about emotional accessibility. After cheating, many women experience what psychologists call emotional narrowing. Their emotional world becomes smaller, more controlled, more guarded. This isn't because they've stopped feeling, it's because feeling too much threatens to break the fragile balance they've created. You may sense that conversations stay on the surface longer than before. Deep talks feel postponed, vulnerability feels delayed. When emotions arise, they're redirected into practicality, humor, or silence. This is not emotional maturity, it's emotional containment. Another shift appears in how she handles conflict. She may avoid it entirely or shut it down quickly, not because she doesn't care, but because conflict opens emotional doors she's actively trying to keep closed. The cost of honesty feels higher than the cost of distance. What's happening internally is this: emotional closeness now carries risk. When a woman cheats, closeness with her partner increases the likelihood of guilt, remorse, and self-confrontation. Distance, on the other hand, offers relief. So the psyche begins associating safety with emotional space. This is why some men feel a sudden imbalance. You lean in, she leans back. You seek clarity, she seeks calm. And the more you try to restore closeness, the more she protects distance, not out of malice, but out of self-regulation. Another subtle but powerful change is in emotional reciprocity. She may still listen to you, but her responses feel measured, less spontaneous, less emotionally risky. It's as if she's managing herself during the interaction rather than experiencing it. And this is painful because the relationship begins to feel managed rather than lived. Men often interpret this as loss of love. In reality, it's loss of emotional safety. Love may still exist, but it's fenced in by fear: fear of collapse, fear of exposure, fear of becoming someone she doesn't recognize. Here's where your response matters more than you think. When men sense this withdrawal, they often increase emotional intensity, more questions, more reassurance seeking, more urgency. While understandable, this can inadvertently reinforce her avoidance. The alternative is not indifference, it's steadiness. Steadiness looks like emotional openness without pursuit, availability without pressure, honesty without interrogation. It's the ability to say through your energy rather than your words, "I am present, but I am not chasing." This kind of emotional posture does something powerful. It removes the pressure that fuels avoidance, and paradoxically, it creates the only environment where emotional narrowing can soften. Whether or not the relationship ultimately heals, this phase is a crossroads for you. You either abandon your center, trying to re-enter hers, or you strengthen your center and allow clarity to emerge naturally. And clarity, real clarity, never comes from force. It comes from emotional integrity. At this stage, a deeper psychological shift often unfolds, one that quietly reshapes how a woman views the relationship's past. Memory itself begins to change, not facts, but emotional meaning. After cheating, many women unconsciously reframe shared history. Moments that once felt loving may now feel confusing. Sacrifices you made may be remembered as expectations. Conflicts that were once minor may suddenly carry new weight. This isn't deliberate rewriting, it's emotional alignment. The mind seeks consistency. If her current behavior conflicts with the idea of a strong, healthy bond, the psyche resolves that tension by downgrading the bond in hindsight. This helps her maintain a coherent sense of self without facing overwhelming regret. You may hear phrases like, "We were never really that close," or "I've been unhappy longer than you realize." These statements feel shocking to men because they contradict lived experience. But psychologically, they serve a purpose. They reduce internal guilt by suggesting inevitability. This is one of the most painful phases for men because it feels like erasure, as if the relationship you believed in is being quietly invalidated. And the instinctive response is to defend the past, to list memories, to prove connection, to argue meaning. But memory shaped by emotion cannot be corrected through evidence. The more you insist, the more defensive the psyche becomes. Another change occurs in how she relates to responsibility. Rather than fully denying her actions, she may emotionally distribute responsibility, highlighting unmet needs, timing, stress, or circumstances. This isn't manipulation, it's self-soothing. Full responsibility would require emotional collapse. Partial responsibility allows survival. What many men don't realize is that beneath this reframing is often sadness, not always visible, not always expressed, but present. Sadness for the loss of who she thought she was, sadness for the version of the relationship that can't be returned to unchanged. Yet sadness is dangerous territory. It leads toward remorse. And remorse requires stillness, honesty, and emotional exposure. So the psyche keeps moving, keeps reframing, keeps narrating. This is where your inner posture matters profoundly. If you respond with resentment or pleading, you become part of the story she needs to distance from. If you respond with silence fueled by bitterness, you disappear emotionally. Neither serves you. The healthiest response is grounded truth. You don't argue memory. You don't beg for validation. You stay anchored in what you know you lived without forcing her to confirm it. Because here's the quiet truth. When a woman rewrites the past to survive the present, the man who doesn't fight that rewrite but also doesn't absorb it maintains his psychological integrity. You are not required to accept a diminished version of your reality in order to keep someone comfortable. And this phase, as painful as it is, reveals something essential, not about her, but about you. Your capacity to hold truth without needing agreement, your ability to grieve without collapsing, your willingness to respect yourself even when the story changes. That strength doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, but it alters the emotional landscape more than any argument ever could. There is a moment that often arrives quietly, without announcement, when the internal pressure she's been managing begins to surface. This is the stage where emotional contradictions can no longer stay fully contained. And when that happens, behavior becomes less consistent. You may notice fluctuations, warmth followed by distance, openness followed by withdrawal, moments where she seems reflective, even remorseful, followed by emotional detachment. This isn't manipulation, it's psychological fatigue. Holding two conflicting identities, the person she believes herself to be and the person she's acted as, requires constant emotional regulation. Over time, that regulation becomes exhausting, and when the psyche gets tired, cracks appear. This is often when guilt leaks through indirectly, not always as confession, but as irritability, sadness, or emotional overwhelm that seems disconnected from the present moment. Small things may trigger disproportionate reactions. She may seem more sensitive, more defensive, or unexpectedly emotional. Men frequently misinterpret this phase. They assume it's the right time to push for answers, to demand clarity, to force resolution. But emotional instability doesn't mean readiness for truth. It means vulnerability. Another change emerges in how she responds to your steadiness. If you've remained calm, grounded, and self-respecting, this is when that presence begins to register. Not as pressure, but as contrast. Your emotional consistency becomes noticeable against her internal turbulence. And that contrast can produce two very different responses. In some women, it awakens accountability. In others, it intensifies avoidance. Which direction it goes depends not on persuasion, but on her capacity for self-honesty. What's important for you to understand is this: you cannot steer that outcome, and trying to will only cost you your center. This phase invites a difficult but necessary shift from monitoring her behavior to observing your own internal state. Are you abandoning yourself emotionally? Are you suppressing anger to keep peace? Are you waiting for clarity that may never come? These questions matter more than any explanation she could offer, because the deepest change after betrayal doesn't always happen in the person who cheated. It happens in the person who was forced to confront uncertainty without control. If you respond to this stage by strengthening your emotional boundaries, by honoring your needs without aggression, you reclaim agency. You move from reaction to authorship. And here's the truth: most men were never taught. Closure is not something another person gives you. It's something you create through alignment between what you feel, what you know, and how you choose to act. Whether she eventually faces herself or continues avoiding truth, your growth does not depend on her readiness. This is where dignity is forged, quietly, internally. Not through dominance or detachment, but through self-respect that doesn't ask permission. And when a man reaches this point, the power dynamic shifts, not outwardly, but fundamentally. The final change is the one almost no one talks about because it doesn't belong entirely to her. It lives in the space between you. After cheating, a woman eventually senses something that can't be argued away or reframed. The emotional atmosphere has changed. Not because of what she did, but because of who you became in response. If you've stayed present without chasing, honest without attacking, grounded without collapsing, she begins to feel a different kind of weight. Not pressure, not fear, but consequence. This isn't about punishment, it's about reality settling in. At this stage, many women experience a quiet reckoning. Not always spoken, not always dramatic. It arrives as a realization that something irreplaceable has shifted. Trust is no longer assumed. Emotional access is no longer automatic. Your attention feels more deliberate. Your energy feels more self-contained. And that can be unsettling. Some women respond to this by moving toward accountability. They soften, they become more honest, they risk vulnerability. Not because they're afraid of losing you, but because they sense that you no longer need them to be whole. Others respond by pulling away further. They interpret your emotional independence as emotional distance, and rather than face the discomfort of self-reflection, they choose escape. Neither response defines your worth, because the final psychological truth is this: betrayal reveals character, but response reveals identity. What ultimately changes in a woman after cheating is not always remorse or clarity. Sometimes it's awareness of the man standing in front of her. No longer reactive, no longer pleading, no longer trying to manage her emotions. And that awareness lingers. Whether the relationship ends or transforms, you walk away with something deeper than answers. You walk away with self-trust. You learn that love without self-respect becomes self-erasure. You learn that emotional strength doesn't come from being unbreakable. It comes from being honest with yourself. And you learn that your value was never determined by someone else's choices. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of your own story, know this: you're not weak for feeling pain, you're not foolish for trusting, and you're not broken because something ended or changed. Growth doesn't always look like improvement. Sometimes it looks like clarity, sometimes it looks like quiet resolve, sometimes it looks like choosing yourself without bitterness. And that is the kind of strength that no betrayal can take from you. If this conversation helped you see your situation more clearly, stay connected. Understanding is not the end of pain, but it is the beginning of freedom.